What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over multiple players on one screen, such as the character select screen or the level select screen, but we're also going to be going over being able to spawn different characters based on what they choose. So, for example, before we were just, okay, player 1 chose mutant, then we're both mutant. But now, if I move my squares around, so the blue square is player 1, the red square is player 2. So I'm moving these guys around. If I press 1 on my keyboard, we don't have any sort of effect yet, but say I press 1 on mutant, then player 1 gets confirmed as mutant. And then if I go around and I select the mannequin with player 2, which is 0 on my keyboard, then player 2 will be the mannequin. I can then hit the continue button, which in reality it should probably go when both players have confirmed, but I'm just trying to separate the functionality so you guys can see what I'm doing. And same with level select. In this case, I'm just going to go whatever player 1 selects is the answer right now. We could do it random, like if they select player 1 and player 2 select different stages, happens to choose one or the other, things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and select this guy. Then we can continue, and you should see I should have a mutant and a mannequin, and we should be on the stage that Shadow Magnus has made. And there we are. So, you can see we have a functional character select screen. Now, before we get started on this, if you're just here for the multiple players on one menu, then that's perfectly fine. If you'd like, I do have the character select screen the way I made it in a separate episode. I think there's 2 episodes on it. Same with the level select screen. So if you want to see how I made those, I'll leave iCards right now for the character select and level select screen. It's not necessary for what we're doing today, so you don't have to watch those first, but if you want to set yours up like I've set mine up, it would be very useful. So we're going to need 2 widgets up, our character select screen, our level select screen, and then I'm also going to bring up our game mode BP, because I'm going to change something with the spawning. Alrighty. To get started today, I made these screens a lot neater, simply by, instead of just dragging everything on and trying to size it properly, I'm going to show you what all my sizes are now and how all of these work. Again, if you haven't watched the first episode, this might look a little confusing to you, but basically I have canvas panels that store everything for me. They store 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, top, bottom. And then I have character selection box is what I'm calling them. This is basically the image that stores the player icon. And then I have a button behind them. Actually, the button's in front of them, but it's being displayed as none. So our boxes before were just kind of, I brought them over and made them whatever size I wanted. Now, if you want to make yours look like mine, all my items, all my sizes are 200. Size X, size Y for everything in here is going to be 200. You can see that. Now for my positions, I keep everything 0, 0 instead of trying to center it and all that garbage. Except for the bottom element, if you've used a canvas panel and separated it by top and bottom like I have, I use position Y at 205 instead of 0, because of course I need it to be below the top image, and also on top of that, it's 205 instead of 200, so you can see a little black line in between. There's a little bit of a gap. Okay. Now, if you can do that for all of these guys. Just make sure you name your buttons separately and your character selection boxes separately. Alright, so that's not too important, but I just want to show you how I made it neater. I did the exact same thing with the level select screen. Everything is now 200. And the bottom one is 205 for both the button and the selection box. So there you go. So that's how I've made this a lot neater. It doesn't look so ugly anymore. And I felt like that was important since we're going into character select screen stuff. I mean, we made it before and it was great, but now that we're not going to be using the mouse as much or at all, and we're going to even get into controller input on the menus, it's important to make this look nice so that when we're working with it, we don't hate ourselves for, for how ugly it is. Okay. Let's go into the character select screen and I'll show you kind of what I've done. Now, the good thing here is there's a lot here. You can see all these functions that I have, and I'm going to move this to the back, are all things we're going to be filling out today. It is a lot of work, but the good thing is that basically you can copy everything that we've done in here and paste into your level select screen, and it will work as long as you make the functions in here as well, and you use level button instead of character button. And I'll get to that when we need it, but I just wanted to show you that this is going to be a lot, but it'll be easily transferable. In our event construct, we're going to set up some listeners so that we can perform logic, because we're basically going to override the system that's in place. The Unreal input system for moving in menus is perfectly fine. It's got a lot of good stuff in it, but I want to make our own because I want to be able to work with a keyboard, 2 players on a keyboard, or 2 players on separate controllers, and that just gets very complicated. So let's go ahead and make our own. Go to Edit, Project Settings, and Input, as we usually do. You can see I have new things set up here. So all the ones that are open are new. And basically it's just the player 1 and player 2 of our inputs. Now, remember, if you're doing controller, you won't need player 1 and player 2. We're going to be doing both. This tutorial is not going to have controllers. The next tutorial will. So there's simply too much in here that we had to do. I didn't feel like adding controllers was going to be... It was going to be way too much to put in this one episode. Okay, so you can see I've got all my inputs in here. Got left, right, up, down for both player 1 and player 2. And then I have confirm for player 1 and player 2. So once you've added them and you've added your keys, you can use whatever keys you want. You can close out of this. What we're going to do is in the construct of our character select screen, we're going to listen for input action. So listen for input action, if you're not familiar, what it does is you can set up a listener, which literally sees if certain conditions have occurred and then triggers an event because of that. So in this case, this listen for input action is listening to see if these input actions are ever getting used, right? So if menu left P1 is used, then we want to use the P1 menu left event that I made. And same for all of these. So don't worry about the events. We're going to make them afterward. We're going to make them in a few seconds, in a few minutes. But let's set up all the listeners first, because you're going to need all of these. Then we're going to have callbacks that relate to every function. So menu left P1, menu right P1, menu up P1, menu down P1, and then you can see these P2, and then menu confirm P1, menu confirm P2. Now, there's other stuff going on here, which I'll get into, but once you've made all these listeners, they have this node called Callback at the bottom of them. So the Callback node can be used to call a function or an event based off of if this occurred or not. So the listener says, okay, menu left P1 was pressed. What do we want to do? That's what the callback does. So all you have to do is add a custom event, and then you name it. I called one P1 menu left, and I already have this, so I'm not going to do it. But that's where all these guys come in from. Then you can literally just drag off the callback and drag it into this corner, and you'll see that it's got a spot for it. So that's excellent. That's perfect. But we need one for each of these because I'm going to make our lives a bit easier by making a function for all the movement. Simply put, I'm going to have an index for what button we're on, and as we press buttons, it's going to basically add or subtract from that index so it knows where we are in the scene. Okay. So let's go ahead and start making some functions, and then I'll go over the way I'm calling them. So move selection, that's the first one. So go ahead and make a new function, hit plus, call it move selection. You'll have nothing but this in here. You won't even have these variables or anything. This one's not too bad because this is copy paste basically, just with one minor change. We are going to do a quick overview of all this, but let's go ahead and add these inputs. So move selection. So what move selection is it determines what index we're on. So let's go to the designer. For example, we're setting up our own input system. So mannequin is 0, mutant is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So if you have 10 boxes like I do, and you can have as many or as little as you like, and this will still work. But if you've got 10 like I do, you'll have 0 through 9 as your indices. Okay, well, that means we want to know what player we are, if we're player 1 or player 2, because we have to know who's selecting what box. And then we also want to know what direction we're going. Direction in terms of, are we moving to the right, left, up, or down? Because they're going to have different values, and we're going to have to change the index differently based on what we select there. So once you've made the move selection function, click on the node or go to the function call itself. Once you clicked on it, go to your inputs, hit plus twice, no parameter, and add 2 integers, player index, and direction. Now, so player index is either 0 or 1, and you can give it a default if you want, like I've given default to 0, but this means player 1 or player 2. Since this is a fighting game and there's usually only 2 players, it's pretty safe to do this. If you intend on having more players, that's perfectly fine, but you should probably keep track of how many players you're going to have. Okay, so the way we're going to track our index that we're on is we're going to have a variable called current P1 selection and current P2 selection. So go ahead and make these. They're 2 integers that basically these determine what index, what character our players are currently selecting for both player 1 and player 2. Then we're going to use them here. So remember, player index is the player that we are, so 1 or 2, and direction is the way we're moving. So if we're moving to the right, so say we're on mannequin, we're at index 0, and we want to get the mutant. If we press right, we have to go positive 1 to get the mutant. So direction of 1 is direction to the right. So when we press right, we want the direction to be 1. If we want to go back to the mannequin, we have to press left, which the only way to get there with the index is -1. We have to go from 1 to 0. So if we press left, we want to give a direction of -1. Now, if we press down, we can do that, that's perfectly fine, but we have to add the row amount here, right? So if we're on mannequin and we want to get to this box below, we have to add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to get to them. Likewise, if we want to go back up to the mannequin, then we have to subtract 5. We have to go from 5 back to 0, so we have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and subtract 5. So if we're going up, it's -5 for the direction. If we're going down, it's +5 for the direction. Now, if you have more slots here, then there's no reason to use this as a hard-coded 5. You use it as whatever value you want that makes sense for you. If you don't have symmetrical boxes, this also might not work for you, but that's okay. There's plenty of ways around it. I'm not going to get into it now, but we can do an asymmetrical character selector level select screen, and I'll show you how that can still work. But if you do have symmetrical and the same amount of selections for each row, you can do it simply like that. I also have this integer called max selections. Now max selections can help you with this too. So instead of just hard coding a 5, we could divide max selections by the row length and things like that. But basically make another integer called max selections and set it to a default value instead of just, this is usually 0 at the start when you make a new variable. Set it to 10 because I know I have 10 characters. You can change it as much as you want, so feel free to change it as you get more characters, or if you're only going to have like 5 characters, then make it 5. Here's where the direction comes in, you can see. So what I do is I check if player 1, so if for player 1, that's what 0 and default go to here, I check if the current P1 selection plus the direction is greater than -1 and it's less than max selections. Then we set the new current P1 selection to current P1 selection plus the direction. So what this is saying, if current P1 selection is 0, like it is when we start the game, see the highlighted box is current P1 selection. So it's 0. Now, if I press right, remember that's a direction of 1 because I'm going over to the mutant. So if it's greater than -1, meaning I would still be on the characters, and it's less than max selections, meaning I would still be on the characters, either I can't go left anymore this way or up anymore this way, right? Because if I try and go up, it's going to say, well, that's less than 0. You're not going to be on any of these boxes anymore. We don't want that. I also can't go off to the right or down below. So, but if it's not less than -1, or if it's not less than or equal to -1, and it's not greater than or equal to max selections, then we can go ahead and move freely between these boxes. Alright. And the exact same thing for player 2, so I don't really have to go over it. Just if it's player 2, use current P2 selection instead of current P1 selection, and then set current P2 selection at the end. Then we're going to call a function called moveSelectionBorder. Okay, so moveSelectionBorder. So go ahead and make a new function, hit plus function right here, call it moveSelectionBorder. Again, when you get into it, you'll just have this. You'll have to add 2 new parameters, player index and new selection. If you go ahead and compile and save, you'll be able to see these if you haven't already. Sometimes when you just make a new function, if you don't compile, you won't be able to add any input. So if it says, please compile this blueprint, just do this. Okay. Now, in here, this is a ton, but it's actually all the same. So this will be very easy to explain. I know it's probably not the neatest, but I did the best that I could with it. Basically, what I'm doing is we're determining where we should put the... we have a little image, right? We have a square that I've added, so I'll show you. In my UI, I have P1 current selection border, P2 current selection border, and then I have both players' current selection. So these are all for... I literally made a square in PowerPoint and just brought it over. It's hollow in the middle. And yeah, this is what goes over our image, over our button, so we know who we're selecting at the moment. So what moveSelectionBorder is it's moving the selection, of course. That's what we did in the previous section, but we're applying the border to that new location. We want to make sure that the border is following the index. So a good way to do that, we have our buttons, okay? Remember I said that they have no image for hovered? Well, that's good. They need something else, though. They need to be drawn as none. Your buttons have to be drawn as none, because if they have any sort of image, for example, if I had, like in character 1 button, if I had one of my overlays or one of my characters on the image, or even if I had a border on here, then it would be blocking this character. Put an image on the button and then put a border on the button as well, but I don't feel like that's necessary for this case. I prefer just to have the image as the character, so they get left alone. We don't have to try and keep track of both of them. The button, make sure it's in front, Z order 10 compared to the box, which is 0. The highest number always appears on top. And then once your button is on the top, make sure the style, normal, is drawn as an image, or drawn as none, and the image has none. Okay? I've also made the tint black because it was white before. I want it to be basically nothing's going on behind our character. These ones I didn't bother changing because the image themselves are white, so you can see all the buttons are still drawn as none with no image, and they're black, but it's not going to change this, so I didn't bother messing with the images yet. Okay, but once you've done that, now what we can do is use the buttons, and we'll be able to set the image and draw it as a box or as a border, depending on what you want. And then that's how we'll get the effect we want. So go into this function if you've added your 2 new input parameters, then we can fill them out in here. So move selection border, we call it the end of move selection. Player index can be hard-coded, so it's either 0 or 1, 0 for player 1, 1 for player 2. And then new selection, it's the same thing as current P1 and current P2 selection. So you just drag them in to the correct spot. Alright, then in here, we take our player index and our new selection. So we do another switch on player index, and we determine for player 0 or player 1, because this is going to determine if we are using the blue border or the red border. It's also kind of going to determine if the blue and red overlap and if we need the purple box. So we do another switch right after that. So drag right off a player index, call switch on it. Easy. This is player 1, this is player 2. You can pick up the default if you want. I wasn't using it for this time, but it really doesn't matter. These should be accurate for now. As you get more complicated, you might want to add defaults and things like that. Okay, then we want the new selection to go into both switch statements. So again, these are the exact same. One is going to be set for player 1, one's going to be set for player 2. So I'll be explaining all this, but I really only need to explain like 1 or 2 boxes and the rest will fall in line. So for player index 0, which means for player 1, we need to do a switch on the new selection. Now we know we have 10 boxes, 10 characters, so we know that there's 10 possible items that our new selection was on. Well, all we do is, for example, if the selection was 0, remember, mannequin is 0, mutant is 1, this is 2, 3, 4. So if the selection is 0, we know it's the mannequin box. So if I try and do this, you can see it goes right into this first one here. And this, what I'm doing here, is I'm calling set style. If you haven't seen this before, it'll look really confusing, but it's not that intimidating. It's just a huge box. So let me show you what I'm doing. If you grab the button that corresponds to this index, you can see I just have them in order. Index 0 of the new selection is character button 1. Index 1 of the new selection is character button 2. Index 2, character button 3, and it's going to go all the way to 10. Same thing every time. I'm just using a different character button. That's literally it. So, for example, let's say you're doing the first one. You can drag your character button onto the graph, drag off of this, if I could grab it, set style. You can do either of these. I like to just set the style flat out by grabbing the struct one here. You can see this is a widget style, button style struct. You can right click on it, split structure pin, and then we're not going to be worrying about hovering or pressed or any of that yet. Let's just worry about the normal. So go to widget style normal and split it again. Then you can select the image and how you want it to be drawn. We want our transparent borders, or red, blue, and purple borders, to be drawn as a box or a border. You can draw it as an image too if you want, but usually box or border just because of the way they draw it as a 3x3, which is useful because that's what our buttons also are set to be. So you can do box or border either way. I'm going to select box because I believe that's what I thought looked better. Yep, you can say a box for everything. And then you can choose your image. So for example, for player 1, we want the P1 border. And of course it doesn't come up. What is it? Border, here it is. P1 current selection border. So we want this guy. That's all we're doing. Those are the two things we're changing. We're going to change it to a box, and we're going to select the image. Then I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste this 10 times over, but I'm going to switch the button every time. So the next one would be character 2 button, character 3 button, so on and so forth. That's literally the same thing I'm doing for all these, okay? We are going to call another function afterward, which I'll get to. But all these that you see are all the same thing. They're all the same thing. And same with player 2, really. So if we're player index 1, which means for player 2, we still do a switch on the same integer, and then we still do the same thing where we go character button 1, set. Character button 2, set. The only difference is you can see we're using a box, but we're using P2 current selection. So basically, if we're player 1, use the blue border. If we're player 2, use the red border. It's that simple. Okay, but we do need to do something called clear path selections. So clear path selections is what I'm calling it. When we move away from the selection we're on, so if we're on the mannequin and I move the mannequin should no longer be lit up. We only want the mutant to be lit up at this point. So we have to revert all the buttons that aren't currently under selection. So after all your sets where you set either the red or blue border for each individual button, I call clear path selection. Every single one for both player 1 and player 2. You can see this. Okay? So go ahead and make a function, another function, call it clear path selections. When you go into it, this one doesn't need any sort of parameters, so you can just leave it alone as a function. This is another one where we're going to just copy and paste the same section of code. Okay, so right off the bat, make a function when you get into here called rp1 p2 on same selection. You don't have to do anything with this function yet. This will be the last part that we do of this section, but I wanted to show you how I got the purple effect if both player 1 and player 2 were on the same spot. So go ahead and make this function, and like I said, you can leave it alone. You don't even have to add the inputs yet if you don't want. But just so we can call it, and then you can copy and paste. Okay, so in clear path selections, what we're doing is we're checking and make sure not player 1 nor player 2 are on the correct, or excuse me, are on that spot. So, for example, in the first case here, we say clear path selections. If current player 1 selection and current player 2 selection aren't 0, so if neither of them are 0, and that's true, then we want to clear selection 1. Clear selection 1. If we go to our event graph, it's just an event where I set the widget style to be drawn as none, and I don't select an image. So, in the event graph, you can see, yet again, I have 10 of these, one for each button. Character button 1, character button 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And they all do the same thing. They set the widget style normal, draw as none, and select no image. The reason I made these events is I didn't want to have 10 functions based on this. Of course, you don't need to do this. You could do it right there on the spot, and that's fine. I made these events because it could be useful to be able to clear the selections at multiple times, such as if they confirm their choice on a character, you might want to remove the box. So I could see different places where we might want to use this, and I didn't want to make 10 functions, so I made these events. So if current P1 selection, current P2 selection aren't 0, and neither of them are 0, then we want to clear selection 1. No one's on it. So for example, right now this case is false because player 1 is on 0. But if player 2 is off of 0, we don't want the box highlighted at all. Now, if player 2 is on 0, we still want player 2 to be shown on 0. But once they move it, box 1 should get cleared. That's what we're doing here. Okay? So make your 10 custom events in your event graph. They have to be in your event graph. They won't work in functions just because custom events can't be created in functions and blueprint graphs, at least not to my knowledge. Then, once you've done that, go ahead in your clear path selections and do the same logic for all 10 buttons yet again. So, in this case, we're checking if it's 0. If it is, if neither of them are 0, so no one's on 0, we can clear selection 1. If it's false, we're going to go ahead and use character button 1 to call RP1 P2 on same selection. So this is how we determine if it's a purple box or not, if both players are on the same index, which is fine. Both players can be on the same index and use it, but this is how we determine it. So if it's false, that current P1 selection is not equal to 0 and current P2 selection is not equal to 0. That means at least one of these is on 0. So remember I said you didn't need to add the inputs earlier. If you didn't, here's what they are. Add them now. I added current button, which is just a button object reference. So if you need to find it, you just type in button, click on this, and go to object reference. That's what current button is. And then I also have an integer called index to check. So it's the index that we need to see if they're on the same button or not. We're not going to get into this function yet. We'll do this at the end. and then copy and paste this code 10 times. Actually, I guess copy and paste it 9 times. So here you go. Everything's going to be the exact same. We're just going to change a few things in each iteration. So I'll have them side by side. In the next iteration, we check and see if anyone's on the index 1, which is the mutant. Because we're going to clear selection 2 if no one's on the mutant. Clear selection 2, what do you know, uses character button 2. Then, in our RP1, P2 on the same selection, we use character button 2 instead of character button 1. We have to know what button we're going to clear, or excuse me, what button we're going to change to the purple color in case that they are on the same button. And then we use the index to check for the index of the button that we're looking for. So whatever you're looking for to see if anyone's on it, that's what you use as the index to check. And then just use the button that corresponds to that. So like clear selection 2, we're using character button 2. Copy and paste, then you do it again. Okay, so we're looking if it's 2, we use index to check 2, character button 3, clear selection 3. Then we're looking for 3, so index to check is 3. We're using character button 4, so clear selection 4. I'm not going to go through it, but it's the exact same for all 10. So there you go. If you want to copy and paste, you can. And there you go. Alright, so let's get into this function here. And this is the last function until the confirm, but the confirm is very short and easy. So let's wrap this up. So RP1, P2 on same selection. So go into this. Now remember, we're giving it a button and an index to check. Now the button is going to be used because that's how we're going to set the style. And the index to check is we're going to check if both players are on that button. So, right off the bat, we're going to see if current P1 and current P2 selection are true. If they're equal, and if that's true. If that is true, then we go ahead and we set the style to both players' current selection border. Okay? The reason we're setting this is we're saying, okay, both players are on the same selection. So, like, if they're both on mutant, they're both on 1. So if they're both on 1, then we want the box of the button we passed it. We passed it, custom button 2 is the mutant. So we passed it, custom button 2. So we can go ahead and set that style to both players' current selection border, which is the purple one. But wait a second. Remember how we were clearing the selection in here? Well, maybe P1 and P2 aren't on the same selection, but even if one of these is on the selection, we don't want to clear it. So if player 2 is on here, we don't want to just say, oh, no, that box is empty. We still want the red overlay, the red box to be on there. So if it's false that they're both on it, we can still do more logic here. We still go over to this next statement and check if current P1 selection is equal to the index to check. So going back here, remember, index to check is checking this button to see if anyone's on it. So we say P1 and P2 aren't on it. That's false. Someone is on it right now. So if someone's on it, let's check who's on it. Is it P1? Current P1 selection is equal to index to check. If it is P1, then we go ahead and set our custom button 1 to P1 current selection border, which is the blue box. If it's false, then we know it's player 2. I still do a check just to be safe, but current P2 selection is equal to the index to check, which means we want to set custom button 1 to P2 current selection border, which is the red one. Okay, so there you go. Now we have it set for all different cases. You can always see that no matter what we're doing, we should have player 1 and player 2 lit up with their borders, and they should be able to move, not go off of the screen, like they have to stay within the character bounds. They can overlap. The only thing they can't do is select the characters, right? We don't have anything for that. We just have them moving around. Well, that's where the confirm selection comes in. So go ahead and make one more function and call it confirm selection. So make a new function here, confirm selection. This one's very simple. We do need a player index and a selection. So player index, of course, is player 1 or 2, and the selection is the index of the character that we've chosen. That way we can go ahead and set them as the player to spawn in the game. So, once you get into your confirmed selection, go ahead and add your 2 inputs, both integers. Drag off your player index, do a switch. Player 0, or, well, index 0 is player 1, index 1 is player 2. Then off your selection, just go ahead and set 2 new variables, confirmed P1 selection or confirmed P2 selection, based off what player it was. So make these 2 variables, they're both integers like current P1 and current P2 selection. Okay. That's all we're doing here. Just once we press a key that we were listening for, we set our confirmed selection. Then when we continue past this screen, it's going to set them to be the official character class for each player. Let's go back into our event graph because we're not done. We made our events and we set up our listens and we made our functions, but we still need to call the functions appropriately. So let's start with the ones at the end of construct. You can see I have all my listens here. But I do have 2 things here at the end called move selection border. It's a function we made earlier. Remember, this is where we determine where the border actually sits. Well, the reason we have this here, you don't need to have this. But I decided I wanted to start 1 player at the top left and 1 player at the bottom right. So if you want that effect, just go ahead and call this. Player 1 should start at new selection 0, and player 2 should start at new selection 9. You can also go ahead, if you want to be really thorough, current P1 selection can default to 0, and current P2 selection can actually default to 9. That's how you can get them separated at the start. You can default them to whatever value you want, or you can actually randomize it if you want them to start on different values, or keep them at the top. It doesn't matter. That was just a little effect I added. Now, let's go ahead and call all the functions once the listeners get called. So remember, anytime we're moving, we want to call the move selection function. So for P1 and P2, left, right, up, and down, we're going to call move selection. Let's cover that. So call move selection, and it's as simple as this. If you're going left, the direction is -1. If you're going right, the direction is 1. If you're going up, -5, or whatever the length of your row is in negative. Like say I have 5, so to go up, I have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like we went over earlier. And then same with down, you got to go down 5, so +5. And then the player index, remember, is 0 or 1. So you can copy and paste these if you want, just change the player index. All the P2s are going to be player index 1 with the same direction. And then we just need to set up the listeners for confirm. Now we already have the listeners set up, but once we have these events, P1 menu confirm and P2 menu confirm, get called because they pressed the confirm buttons, we need to call the confirm selection function that we made. We need to pass it the current P1 or current P2 selection based on the player index, which is 0 and 1. Because whatever object we're over, like if I'm over this one and I press it, then I can just use current P1 selection as my confirmed P1 selection, because that's the character I press the key on. Now, I changed this up a bit. Before we were clicking on the character and it was instantly bringing that character class. Now what I want to do is actually on press of this confirm button, which you don't have to add the confirm button if you don't want, but I literally just brought another button onto the screen and added it. The confirm button is used to determine if we're ready to go to the next screen. Okay, so if we go to our graph, again, confirm button on pressed. So if you click on your button, if you click on your confirm button, you can scroll down and hit on pressed. That's what I'm using here. When we press this, we set our different classes. Now, remember, last time we only had character class and that was it for our game instance. But now we want to separate our character classes based on what our characters pick. So, if you've been following the series, you'll have this. If not, you may need to make something like this. I have a base game instance that has character class. It just had character class before. But now I want P1 character class and P2 character class. So go ahead and separate these. And then build, solution, compile it in Unreal if necessary. Once you've done that, we're going to change this up. So once the confirm button has been pressed, we're going to get the game instance. We're going to make sure we can cast the base game instance. If we can, we're going to grab confirmed P1 selection and confirmed P2 selection and separate the classes correctly. So if confirmed P1 selection is either, if it's 0, it's the mannequin. If it's 1, it's the mutant. Remember, 0, mannequin, 1, mutant. And if it's default, I made it mannequin just so it does spawn something. Same with P2, but we're setting P2 character class instead of P1 character class. Then we're still going to create the level select screen widget and add it to the viewport. And we're officially done with the character select screen, which is excellent news. There is one more thing we have to do in the default game mode BP. So right here in the determine character class, we were using a character class as the enum here, but we're going to go ahead and add a player index to determine character class, which my event graph is gone for some reason. So you can see we come into the event graph, we go into spawn players, and spawn players checks if you're at P1 or P2 start tag. Then depending on what you are on, it'll call determine character class. I've added a player index, so just click on your determine character class function, add a new input, player index. It's an integer. If it's the top one, player 1, then player index 0. If it's the bottom one, player 2, player index 1. Then we use this integer we do a switch on it, and we determine which character class we should use when spawning the object. So if we're spawning the first character, then we want to use the P1 character class. Otherwise, if we're spawning the character for player index 1, which is player 2, we want to use P2 character class. Then the rest of the logic is the same. We either spawn a mannequin or we spawn a mutant. And that's all for the game mode. So now you should be able to spawn your characters based on what you select in the character select screen, and they're actually different options, or they can be. They can also be the same option. Lastly, you can go ahead and copy everything from the level select screen over to the character select screen. The only thing I've changed is on my confirm button. I'm not doing any sort of logic where I'm setting things in the game state or the game instance. I'm just checking the confirm P1 selection, so whatever player 1 confirmed, and setting that as the level to open. But you can copy all the functions exactly, and it will work. The only thing you need to change is, and it will tell you this, but you need to change your character buttons to level buttons, because the character buttons don't exist in the level select screen. So you have to switch them to your level buttons that you have. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this episode. I really hope it helped you. I know this was a loaded one, but it's an important one. So hopefully this helps you get set up and make your character select screen a little bit more the way you want it. In the next episode, we'll be going over controllers with menus, so you'll be able to actually have 2 players on your menu working like that, as opposed to 2 on a keyboard. And then we'll be getting into some stuff like making it fancier, like actually spawning your actors in the scene so you can see them when you select your character. It's going to be really fun. Thank you guys so much for watching. If this video helped you, please subscribe. It helps me more than anything else you can do for the channel, and I just really appreciate it. It lets me know I'm doing a good job. If you had any issues with this video or any of my other tutorials, feel free to join the Discord for extra support. We'll be happy to help you with any issues you had in general, but also I can kind of explain things with pictures and videos if you need to as well. And lastly, guys, if you want to come support us on Twitch, twitch.tv/Shawnthebro27. We play Dark Souls games on Wednesday, Resident Evil games on Friday, so it's a really fun time. We're actually going through the Dark Souls 2 DLC right now, as well as playing Resident Evil 7 on Madhouse difficulty. And now I am out of breath because I've been talking for a long time, so thank you guys so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, my friends.